The smell hit the courtiers long before they saw the king. It wasn't the scent of royal perfumes or expensive incense, but the cloying, sweet stench of rot that could be smelled through the thick stone walls of the palace. By his final years, servants had mastered a practiced dissociation, breathing through the mouth, holding their expressions in serenity, while their eyes watered against the smell. Incense burners ran around the clock. None of it was sufficient, because the source of the smell could not be masked or managed away. The source of the smell was the king himself, and he was rotting alive. Imagine a man who commanded the divine right of a nation, yet was forced to watch his own legs turn into a gallery of horror while he was still alive. A man whose word could end a dynasty or dispatch an archbishop to the fire, and who could no longer walk the length of his own throne room without the support of iron-tipped poles and the arms of men trained to make their assistants invisible. We often think of history through sanitized legends. The 6 wives, the break with Rome, the grand banquets. These are the images that centuries of careful curation have handed down to us. The Holbein portrait, the spread legs, the vast chest, the expression that dares the world to find him anything less than permanent, has done its job across 500 years. But the story of Henry VIII's final years is something far more primal. It is a study of what happens when a human being maintains total, undisputed power over the physical world, only to realize he is a slave to his own biology. In the next 10 minutes, we are stripping away the Hollywood makeup to find the real Henry. Like the incorruptible Robespierre, whose moral architecture crumbled when his own jaw was shattered by a pistol ball on the night before his execution, or King Ferdinand VII of Spain, whose grotesque anatomical reality shaped the political fate of an entire nation, Henry discovered that power has a human cost but cannot be paid in gold and cannot be delegated to a minister. You're going to discover the unsanitized reality of a man who was once called the Golden Prince of Europe, praised by Erasmus himself, celebrated across the continent as living proof that a king could be both warrior and scholar, but who ended his days as a heap of decaying flesh, hidden behind curtains and protocol, suffusing his palace with the stench of his own corruption. This is an investigation into the medical horror of the Tudor throne. To understand the monster, we must first look at the hero. In his youth, Henry was an apex predator of the court, literate, cultured, and physically magnificent. He stood over 6 feet tall at a time when the average Englishman barely reached 5 feet 6. He could draw a war bow. Most soldiers could not bend and debate theology as a scholar's equal to the finest minds on the continent. He was the complete Renaissance prince, intellect and physical power unified in a single terrifying instrument of will. But in 1536, a catastrophic accident during a jousting tournament at Greenwich began the slow demolition of everything Henry was. His horse fell at full charge. The king was thrown with violent force, and hundreds of pounds of armored horseflesh came down on top of him. He lay unconscious for 2 full hours. When he finally recovered, the crisis seemed to pass, but the wound to his left leg, already compromised by an older ulcer that had resisted every treatment, had been driven into a depth no physician of the Tudor age possessed the tools to reach. From this moment on, Henry's life became a captivity to his own agony. Much like the rigid logic of the first emperor of China, Henry became increasingly haunted by his own mortality. His physical limitation didn't just break his body, it manufactured a new architecture of fear in everyone around him. Because if the king was visibly, undeniably suffering, then the king's invincibility was a performance. And that realization was dangerous to every person whose survival depended on his infallibility. Think about it. Do you maintain the image of a god-king when you can no longer walk without the rhythmic thud of a cane? When you must be lifted from your chair by gloved hands that dare not visibly strain? And your own guards have been quietly trained to cover their noses against your presence. By the 1540s, Henry's legs were no longer limbs. They were monuments to infection. He suffered from chronic weeping ulcers that physicians of the time much like those who examined the aberration of nature that was Ferdinand VII, could not cure and barely understood. Historians now propose overlapping causes: a bone infection dying from within, venous ulceration from his catastrophic weight, and very possibly type 2 diabetes, which would have destroyed his capacity to close any wound at all. The ulcers opened, they wept, they sealed partially, trapping infection beneath the skin. Then they reopened, wider. The tissue around them blackened and hardened. The smell was not the neutral decay of something long dead. It was the active, biological odor of a living system consuming itself, warm and sweet and relentless. The treatment was a choreographed piece of state theater. Surgeons would use heated pincers and hot oil to cauterize the wounds, creating a sensory-rich reality of burnt flesh and metallic blood that was indistinguishable from torture. Like Vlad the Impaler's grotesque garden, the king's bedchamber was a place where the human body survived by inches, held together by will, ritual, and the constant ministrations of frightened men who understood that a fatal outcome on the royal dressing table could very easily become their own. Imagine the terror of a man who controls the lives of millions, who can behead a queen with a word, but cannot stop the literal decomposition of his own tissue. He was an omnipresent myth while still alive, his portrait projecting omnipotence across every court in Europe. But his reality was one of curtained isolation and darkness, of a body that was methodically, remorselessly betraying the mind trapped inside it. As the king's health collapsed, the machinery of power had to adapt. Just as King Leopold used administrative records to hide a regime of horror, Henry's court developed a bureaucracy of the bedchamber to manage the king's decay. Special wheeled chairs and leaning posts were engineered along his most used corridors. A mechanical hoist, recorded in court documents as a chair of estate, was engineered specifically to raise and lower his nearly 400 pounds between floors, because the staircase had become an impossible geography. Echoing the engineering interventions used for Ferdinand VII's specific anatomical reality, this wasn't mercy. It was population maintenance for the Tudor dynasty. Was he a visionary who paved the way for a nation? Or a man whose brilliance was swallowed by his own shadow? Like the incorruptible Robespierre, the king's moral rigidity in church matters was inseparable from the uncontrolled savagery of his physical state. When everything physical has failed you, the compulsion to become absolute in the non-physical realm becomes merely irresistible. Henry chose theology. He chose law. He chose the pure, controllable architecture of royal decree, because these were territories his rotting legs could not invade. Pain is a weapon of mass manipulation, not only when inflicted on others, but when experienced privately by the one who holds power. As Henry's body rotted, his mind became a battlefield of survival. He saw enemies of the state in every shadow, much like Qin Shi Huang, who never slept in the same place twice. He used psychological warfare to ensure that proximity to the king was no longer a guarantee of safety. It was a threat. He hacked his protectors to pieces, politically and literally. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the Reformation, the man who had served Henry with machine-like efficiency for a decade, was beheaded on charges he was never permitted to answer in open court. The men of the inner circle could never know which version of Henry awaited them behind the chamber door: the sharp intellect of a good morning, or the pain-maddened sovereign when the fever had climbed and the world had contracted to a single burning point. He turned the ritual structure of the court into an inescapable trap, where a single unpredictable variable, the wrong word at the wrong hour, a glance that could be read as contempt, could lead to the Tower of London and everything that followed. The court learned to read him the way sailors read weather, not from curiosity, from survival. In January of 1547, the sword of the dragon finally fell. Like the first emperor, Henry died clutching at a life that was slipping through his fingers like sand. His voice had diminished to a rough whisper, its own horror for a man whose voice had been his primary instrument of dominion. He called for Archbishop Cranmer in his last hours. Cranmer arrived to find a man who could no longer form clear words, only a single squeeze of the hand when asked whether he died in faith. That single squeeze, history does not tell us whether to find it dignified or heartbreaking. Perhaps that ambiguity is the most honest response it allows. The real horror of Henry VIII isn't the 70,000 people he reportedly executed, though that number demands to sit with us for a moment. 70,000 human lives in a country of perhaps 2.5 million. This is not a rounding error. It is a sustained reign of terror, conducted across decades by a mind that converted private suffering into public annihilation. No, the deepest horror is something more contemporary and therefore more disturbing. We have rehabilitated the monster. We celebrate his harsh justice and the golden cup of the English Renaissance. While carefully ignoring the screaming forests of the dead, he left in the wake of his paranoia the judicial murders dressed in the language of treason, the burning of people for their theology. The stench has been perfumed out of the historical memory. Henry proved that ultimate cruelty equals ultimate power, only if you can control the narrative. He was a damaged human given the opportunity to spread his damage, proving that monsters don't need fangs, they just need power and a damaged soul. Henry VIII was a man who built a throne and called it justice, who built a church and called it conscience, who built a legend and called it truth. He lived his final hours in exquisite suffering, confined to rooms that smelled of his own dissolution, attended by men who feared and pitied him in equal and irreconcilable measure, his mind still working behind a body that had long since begun its exit from the world of the living. He remains a grim reminder that no matter how many walls you build, no matter how many legal traps you set, no matter how many voices you silence in the service of your own myth, the physical reality of being human is inescapable. Biology does not recognize divine right. Infection does not bow to royal decree. The body is always the final authority. The history we think we know is often just a mask for a much darker, more human reality. The most dangerous thing about that mask is how comfortable we have become wearing it on his behalf. If this investigative deep dive into the medical horror of the Tudor Rose gave you a new perspective on power, hit the subscribe button. I'll see you in the next investigation.